Welcome to FMRPG, the podcast that doesn't care if you like inputs, outputs, both, or none, as long as we can run the edge and fight the corpse. We can all be chooms. I'm Richie Buzzkill, and tonight I have Alan Bahr with me to talk about one of my favorite genres, Cyberpunk. How you doing, Alan Bahr?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Richie Buzzkill?
Caffeine is kicked in. I got the pink light on, so if you're on the you're just listening to this audio, we look fucking fantastic as Cyberpunks. Alan has got some amazing glasses on that are and a little hat. It's we look like full-on punks. You should check out the YouTube sometime because that's where this will be. Yeah, man. Like, what? Well, I'm gonna follow the format because I have been playing a Cyberpunk game, but just not on the tabletop recently. So how about you? What have you been playing, Alan? I know this is a long list, so we can get into it.
Oh my god. So we've been playing Outcast Silver Raiders. The OSR RPG. Yep. We've been doing a mega dungeon. That's been a lot of fun.
Nice.
We've been doing play tests, been doing my usual wargaming shenanigans. The same old, right? Like I play war games. I play 4 or 5 RPGs a week. We're just spinning up a Vampire Dark Ages Chronicle. It's gonna be a lot of fun. So,
ooh, where is the Dark Ages Chronicle going? Are you running this? Where is it going to be?
No, I'm actually a player. This is I don't know. Everybody in the group's a game designer, and I have not been asked to run yet. So I'm busy like not doing that.
Nice.
And I'm certainly not going to volunteer myself.
Fair enough.
My heart dropped when somebody mentioned Tiny Cyberpunk at one point. Like, oh, that looks really cool. Maybe we should play that. And I was like, say no. Everybody like, no, we already agreed to change. Let's just keep going. I was like, yes.
Right.
So
yeah. Well, do you know where it's going to be set? When it's going to be set yet?
Constantinople, Istanbul.
Nice.
Yeah.
So
should be good. Should be fun.
The fun with the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah. We're gonna have a good time.
Yeah, I've basically I spent like 35-40 hours playing Cyberpunk 2077 with the new expansion. That's what I've been
I've had to wait because I can't start it until I finish this project. So
the carrot and stick approach.
Well, I don't want to contaminate my like if it wasn't already based on a tabletop RPG, I'd be like, that'll be okay. But because it's, I don't want to pull a full like U-turn, right, and take something that came from an RPG through a video game back necessarily.
Well, I mean that's every piece of media, and we'll get into Cyberpunk media has fed into what you're writing, right? So like,
no, absolutely. But I want to be careful. Like I nothing but respect for Mike Pondsmith and the team over at Artal. And the last thing I want to do is step on their toes because they do fantastic work. So.
Yes, they do, and I haven't yet picked up the new Danger Girls book, but it's on my list of things to pick up. So
I'm hoping in my Secret Santa game exchange, I'm going to end up with it because it was on my list. So
nice, yeah. So, but I don't have that problem where I'm contaminating myself for writing something interesting and different.
Right.
So because I spent like 90 hours after probably 6 months it came out. The first time I played. Yeah. So this time I've gotten to the point where there's a very difficult choice to make in the game. And they've set up this choice for a long time and I can't make that choice yet. I just and it's in
You want me to make it for you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There's 2 options.
Yeah, there's 2 options. Yep.
Okay. You assign an A to one and a B to the other.
Okay.
Don't tell me what.
Okay. So I got A and B. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. I'm gonna pick B. You got to do that one now.
All right. Okay. That is an interesting choice.
All right, there we go.
We'll see how that runs out, and I will I will
You should just
finish.
let your Patreons vote next time. Like
I
if you're like, I don't know what to do, boom, Patreon bonus.
that's true. I will. That's next time I get a difficult choice like that. I should post that up.
What
Um,
character do I main in my WoW raid tonight, guys?
well,
Boom.
this is closer to what we actually talk about on this show because it is a,
Right.
as you said, it's based on the classic game.
Yeah.
So, and it has it
Yeah.
bleeding through its
All right.
every inch, which is fantastic. Uh, um, yeah. So that's kind of what has been consuming me and why I haven't posted in a little bit
Nice.
because I got
Yeah.
distracted by running around Night City on a motorcycle.
It's gorgeous looking game. I have played some of it already, and I'm psyched because of the expansion. But I've had to be like, nope, I have work to do. This is like a Christmas, Thanksgiving break kind of thing. I got to get this stuff done.
Yeah.
Maybe then I can sit down and just kind of like we're not going anywhere for Christmas, my wife and I. So like my plan is just to sit down and like we're not going anywhere. Nobody's coming over. Just gonna grind it out. Like I'm gonna
Well,
do what I want. A couple days.
and there's probably going to be like 4 foot of snow on the ground, so
That's true.
you don't want to go anywhere when you're in North Dakota in the middle of end of December, beginning January. Like,
Yeah, that's fair.
um, but yeah. So, but as you can tell, we're both big fans of Cyberpunk. I wanted to get into talking about Cyberpunk in this episode,
Heard.
and then Alan, who has a Kickstarter of a Cyberpunk game, can plug that, and then we can get into a couple what I call quick cutting questions about
Boom,
that
boom, boom.
at the end. So,
Let's do it.
but what was your first exposure to Cyberpunk? Like, what was?
Oh, well, I read Snow Crash at a very young age, like maybe early middle school.
Which I freaking love that novel, and I know that there's some problems with that novel, but I
Yeah,
freaking love it. And
yeah,
it was not my first exposure. My first exposure was probably, if you count Akira as Cyberpunk,
sure.
I think I'll count that movie when I watched it when I was 13 as like the thing
And
that
I'm kind of going
rewired my
off.
brain.
I'm kind of going off what's stuck in my head.
Right.
Like, for all I know, I caught some Ghost in the Shell or Akira on like Toonami late at night as a kid, right?
Yeah.
But
No,
it
I
never
mean, I'm
stuck with
sure.
me. So like that's the first time it stuck with me. And it was a pretty swift descent after that. Read all of Gibson, read all of Stevenson, started getting into the more esoteric, maybe, or less pop culture oriented cyberpunk novels, maybe we'll say, right? Uh, 'cause you have this Philip K. Dick, you have this Stevenson, you have this Gibson, and they're kind of like the holy trinity of literary cyberpunk in a lot of ways. I'm not saying they were the first, I'm not saying they're the most influential necessarily, but they're sort of the most prevalent or well known, right?
Absolutely. Like, I have read
Uh,
all of Gibson's novels. I've read
right.
all of Stevenson's novels. I've read a
They
few of Philip K. Dick novels because they are the most
right.
challenging.
They are rough, yeah. Not in a bad way, but like just hard to read.
Right.
Yeah.
They're beautiful, but
Um,
they're also really they're
but
challenging.
then you have the other stuff like Burning Chrome, and a lot of the other, either precursors or maybe less pop culture prevalent, which makes, for me, growing up in Bismarck, North Dakota, made them a little harder to find, right? My access was to whatever my small public library would stock, which was generally, you know, something off the New York Times bestseller list or equivalent, or what I could get at the local Walden Books, right?
Right. Well, see,
So,
it was more of a video media for me for a long
mm,
time because I didn't have money to buy those books. So
see,
yeah, my local, you know, library didn't really have them. I guess they probably
yeah,
did
see,
have some of them, but
I grew up in a big family, one working parent, so we were, my recollection is we were not well off. Uh, I don't know how close to the poverty line or whatever we were dancing, but with 6 kids, I'm sure, and one government salary, I'm sure we weren't riding high above it.
no.
But
That sounds like
you know,
you're just skimming right along right there.
we were, it was for me, it was when I was at the public library or the school library. Like we didn't rent movies. I didn't even have a video game console till I was, my first one was Nintendo 64, right? Like, which I would have been 12, 14, right? Something like that.
Yeah.
Um, and like it was already out of date by the time we got one.
Oh yeah.
And so like
we had a Nintendo. We had a Nintendo from a garage sale in like
right,
1996.
right. And so, my parents didn't really they loved the fact that I wanted to read so much, so they didn't really police what I read as much as maybe they
Nice.
should have.
Right.
But whereas because there were 6 kids and I was the oldest, if I brought a movie home, it got policed because the other
Oh,
siblings could see it,
right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I didn't really have a lot of chance to expose myself to any visual media, but the books, yep, that was fair game growing up. So
Yeah, because my cousin was, just at that age when VHS anime started coming into the be more prevalent in the video stores. So
mhm.
he had rented Akira and Ghost in the Shell, and like that just like, and of course I'm a couple years younger than him, so I'm watching this and going, oh.
Right, exactly, right. Like, and for me, I hit it was Appleseed was my first cyberpunk sort of visual media probably. And that was in college when I was a freshman. I had a roommate who loved anime, and you're like, you got to see this Appleseed thing. It's so good. I'm like, what's Appleseed?
Right.
And
It's such
it
an
was
innocuous
Appleseed,
title for what it
right? Like,
is.
it's science fiction. Is it like about like a science fiction Johnny Appleseed? Like, what's the dealio here? And then it was spiraling down from Appleseed, Ghost in the Shell, Akira, right, into even more obscure esoteric stuff, Blade Runner, which I contend is not truly cyberpunk, obviously, but you have your spread there.
That could be a whole episode discussing
So yeah.
whether or not Blade Runner is cyberpunk. I would contend that is some of the roots of cyberpunk, in the fact that the noir aspects of that has been like this like feed line through everything after that.
Oh,
But
legit. No, and I certainly wouldn't deny that it has an influence at the minimum visually.
oh, absolutely, visually is like bedrock. Like,
It's arguably definitive visually, right?
yeah. Uh,
But it noir and punk are at a level in many ways antithetical to each other.
yeah, absolutely.
Like
Like,
noir is sort of grim acceptance and desperation, whereas punk is active, aggressive, almost revolution or anarchy or rejection, right? They at their core they feed very different sides of the coin. And I
yeah.
guess now we're moving on to the next round of stuff, right?
Well,
We sort
yeah.
of segued in.
I mean, it was a good segue. I mean, what is like, and this is Mike Marines, one of the homies on
Yeah,
the
yeah.
on the Discord, was like, what is
What's up,
your
Mike?
favorite Patreon favorite cyberpunk media? Like,
Yeah,
and we
yeah,
mentioned
yeah.
some of this stuff already. I kind of just like dumped my list from something else in
Yeah.
there, but
Yeah. So I mean you got the classics, right, which I adore. For me, I really love the underappreciated stuff. So like uh things like Altered Carbon, they're fine, right? I don't think they're bad. But for me, like if you haven't seen Mute,
I have not.
it's a movie on Netflix about a mute, and I forget what denomination, but an Amish style religious person, the rejection of technology for the
Right.
most part, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a cyberpunk dystopia, and this person he has a bond with goes missing,
Oh, nice. Or
and
bad,
so
but
it's this right. It's got like Paul Rudd in it randomly, like, but it's called Mute. It's like I'm not going to claim it's a masterpiece, right? But it's a very interesting assessment of what cyberpunk looks like for somebody who is on the outside of technology by choice, right? But also on the outside of connection of the one thing that keeps people grounded in a cyberpunk, which is human connection trumping technology in a lot of ways. Well, this person's mute, they can't talk. So now human connection is also they're the outsider. So what does that world suddenly look like to them, right? And so for me, a lot of the cyberpunk media I really love is the stuff that provokes me to look at it from a different lens. It's easy to find cyberpunk media that's corporations bad, technology sometimes good, sometimes bad because it comes from corporations, right? We're gonna overthrow things, we're gonna have revolution, you know, or the noir equivalent of desperation and kind of resigned acceptance, maybe, of the situation at hand. Um, and that's all great, but that's almost like the obvious cyberpunk, right? Like, I want to know about the rest of it.
Right. There is so, I mean, like we were talking about earlier, I think there are two threads in cyberpunk media, and that's the
Right,
noir thread and the punk thread.
right.
And I think that a lot of media doesn't, it doesn't quite, like, a lot of it kind of tries to ride the line, like, and we
Sure.
have this constant discussion about punk on the Discord. Every time something new called something punk comes up, it's like, well, is that actually punk, or are you just like slapping that on the end of your thing? And I think cyberpunk is the somewhat the root of that idea because it
It's sort
was
of at the root of that conflict, right?
right. It is the root of that conflict because it's about using technology to rebel or rebelling against
Right.
technology, and it gets lost as you keep photocopying the word punk. It just gets blurrier and blurrier.
Well, and I think I like to delineate between cyberpunk and cyber noir, right? For me, because I think I'm big on words matter, right? And so cyber noir is Blade Runner, cyberpunk would be, something else, right? Um, Johnny Mnemonic, it's cyberpunk because he's trying to take down the system, right? At the end there, that's kind of the push. And so for me, noir is what happens when the punks lose,
Yeah, no, that is fair
right?
because it's like Blade Runner. Like clearly there was a lot of upheaval in Blade
And
Runner
that's and now people have just accepted that this is the way things are because they've lost.
because Blade Runner is a wholly different thing than the actual media that it was based on.
Right.
Do androids dream
Absolutely.
of sheep?
Yeah.
Is a wholly different thing and remarkable in its own right. But I think the like, yeah, once the rebellion has like lost, because it
Right.
inevitably will lose because someone will betray someone else, which is I think one of the crossover between the two threads is
Yep.
the sudden but
Betrayal.
inevitable betrayal is in both of these things. Like that's where the Venn
Yeah.
diagram
Absolutely.
meets. And that like that crossover between those, it is then you get into the cyber noir, which is also one of my favorite genres. Like, don't get me
Adore it.
wrong,
Yep.
like because like one of my favorite
I wrote a
novels.
whole I wrote a whole RPG about it. Crescendo Violence is literally a cyber noir RPG where I go on this like one page screed about why it's not cyberpunk. So
Yes, that is a fantastic fantastic game, and I should get that off the shelf. But like 36 Streets is that
right.
kind of like, but and I had that conversation with the author, but like it is kind of on the edge of both of those things. It
Yep.
rears deeply into cyber noir, and that's one of my favorite recent pieces of cyberpunk media, cyber noir media kind of thing.
Yeah. I if I was gonna tell somebody to pick up a book, I would say read Midnight Water City, which is this fantastic it's a little more cyber noir at the start, but it gets pretty cyberpunk by the end novel about an underwater sort of dystopian cyberpunk city. And there's a couple of them, there's a series and they're great. And then I would also tell folks, if you haven't watched the black and white remastered edition of Johnny Mnemonic, you are missing out.
Well, I haven't watched Johnny Mnemonic since the 90s, so
If you don't watch the original, I mean, I love the original too, but like, if you can find a copy, I think it's in like Blu-ray only, but if you can get a copy of the black and white Johnny Mnemonic and black and white remaster, it changes everything about that movie.
well that's great because I mean I like that actually. It's one of those movies where I actually like it because it is sort of
Mhm.
close to the original short story.
Yeah.
In a way, how do you make a short story into a long movie? Well, you're going to have to take some detours from the original source material.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and I think that's from Gibson's Burning Chrome, isn't it? Or his entry? Yeah. So I love that short story. a collection of all those little short, like, and
Right.
it's building worlds, building a world in itself that kind of leads you to the Sprawl trilogy of
Yeah.
Neuromancer, Count Zero, and Mona Lisa Overdrive. Like that, like you pick up a Gibson novel nowadays, it's a kind of a completely different thing. He's doing a completely different thing than he was in the 80s when he invented some of these terms that we use, cyberspace and some of these other things.
Yeah, and technology changes, right? Like the way computers work now is not at all how they worked during Neuromancer when he was writing, right? You have these in some ways cyberpunk is a genre that will never be able to keep up with the actual changes in technology.
Which is what he says about what he's writing now, which
Right.
is like, if I write it today, yeah, it's 20 minutes in the future, but by the time it's published, it's already, that 20 minutes has already
Right.
passed. So it's almost like, yeah, cyberpunk in some ways becomes a retro future thing
Yeah.
almost immediately, and it's easier to do as a retro future because you have this, like,
Right.
everything is moving so fast and you can't write ahead unless you write too far ahead, and then it becomes
Sci-fi.
transhumanism or some of these other further afield genres that are somewhat harder
Right.
to get into.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that makes people love cyberpunk so much is that ephemeral, I can't quite define or grab it nature of it. Are we living in a cyberpunk future? Yeah, maybe actually, right?
I mean,
By the time we figure out if we are, will we have moved past it? Yeah, probably.
yeah.
One way or another, right? Like,
Well, I mean, you look at all of, and this is a game that we were sort of dancing around earlier. If you look at Cyberpunk 2013, 2020,
right,
you look at all of the predictions of the timeline to get to 2020, there's a bunch of stuff that comes true. Like it
yeah,
absolutely happens. Now, it's not the same way, and we didn't get some of those technologies.
yeah,
We don't have
yeah,
the neural interface
yeah,
mostly yet. Uh, but there's a bunch of stuff that absolutely becomes true, and it's the world we live in.
yeah.
So
In
like,
a lot of ways, we kind of got the wish version of a cyberpunk future, like kind of the shitty, like Temu wish version here. So,
okay, so that may be what I call my because I was writing at one point, I was writing a hack of Cyberpunk Red that was called the Buzzkill hack, and
nice.
I might have to call it Cyberpunk Wish Edition.
Yeah,
Um,
there you go.
because
Yeah,
I do love, because it's it's high technology, low lifestyle is kind of where that
right.
game comes from, and it's
Yep.
supposed to be, but it doesn't always succeed, and there's
Yeah.
reasons for that. But like that idea of you're using the toy your little brother was playing with, they got killed in the
Right.
street, to hack the
Right.
Gibson in the tower of the corp. It's like that,
Exactly. Right.
and that's the kind
And
of
that's
like,
super.
go
Yeah.
ahead.
Well, that's super important, right? Like, I think I think the best cyberpunk media is the one that understands that at its core, a cyberpunk story is a really simple piece of revolutionary or resistance based media, right? Like at the bare minimum, cyberpunk is about being people who don't have the power, trying to stick it big ways, little ways, whatever ways, stick it to the people who have the power.
Yeah, and that, I think that's, to me, the heart of cyberpunk. If
Right.
you're not
Exactly.
doing that, and that's one of the, and it is one of the problems in the genre is, and I think there's media that covers this really well,
Right.
like RoboCop.
Right.
He's literally being used by the man to,
Right.
and then
Exactly.
he rebels against the man. But a lot
Right.
of people don't see it as that because he is a cop, right?
Right.
That intrinsic
Well,
nature.
and that's where you get to the argument of is Blade Runner cyberpunk if Deckard is employed by the man, right? He makes his money, he makes his living sort of oppressing marginalized individuals on the outskirts, right? He is punching down professionally.
Yes,
That is
he is, and he is. It's only and you could sort of think that he tried to make some decisions that were counter to that, and then they came back
Right.
on him, and then
Right. But by the end, for me, when I define Cyberpunk, I look at the arc, right? Is Deckard's arc about resistance? Well, the answer is no.
right.
Right. Is Deckard's arc about, trying to get some measure of comeuppance against people in power? No, he's actually pretty much spends the whole movie sticking it to the oppressed.
Yeah,
If we're being
I mean, and
right,
the and you sort of like nowadays you sort of think it's, and I think the reason that Blade Runner 2049 went this way is having the android as the main character, because
right.
you watch Blade Runner and the androids are sympathetic.
Oh
Like,
yeah, yeah. Deckard's not the hero.
yeah, which
He's the protagonist,
right.
but he's not the hero.
And that's sort of like, that's sort of a thread through a lot of cyberpunk media, as like, they're not, I mean, sometimes people they're doing their thing for their own reason, right? You look at like what Cyberpunk 2013 was based on, which is kind of like the Hardwired novel. It's kind of
Yeah,
like it.
and,
You look
yep,
at a lot of the stuff in there, like, yeah, he's
yeah,
just doing things for his own reason. Like, he's not a
right,
hero. He's just an asshole. Like,
right. And to me, well, maybe this is a good time to move on to the next segment,
sure,
right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
what makes a cyberpunk RPG,
yeah.
right?
What is a cyberpunk RPG? What can we do about, can we
Right.
play these characters nowadays?
Well, and so I think there's an important thing as a game designer to delineate what the game is supposed to do versus what it can or will do versus how somebody is going to use it.
Right.
Right? There are three different pillars and axes. And much like an author or any artist, there is both part of me in the work I create as well as a lot of not me, because my job is to create something that everybody can attach to or be transported by, right? Like if it was just Alan's reflection of things, it would be interesting to me. Not sure it would be interesting to everybody else, right?
Well, I think that's like, that's the struggle of every writer,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
And I think making those decisions for yourself. I mean, you have obviously found an audience of people that likes your
Yeah,
take
absolutely.
on things. So, but for
Yeah.
someone that's trying to write from a first or just writing a
Yeah.
game, even an adventure for their friends
Right.
to play, like, you're kind of like somewhat doing some
Yeah.
tailoring to the audience a little bit.
No,
So,
absolutely. And so, I think when we talk about this, so the reason I'm I'm here is, let's just say it, I'm here to talk about Tiny Cyberpunk, my Kickstarter for a Cyberpunk RPG. Like, I guess we should have led with that. Go back my Kickstarter, give me your money. Um,
he has an ulterior motive to be here. He's doing what he wants. I'm literally just.
I would be here anyway because I like Richie and the FM group, but like also I'm plugging my stuff. Buy it,
Right.
support me.
Well, and we'll get to the corporate
Yeah,
your shilling
yeah,
portion later. All right.
yeah. So but when I sat down to think about Tiny Cyberpunk, right, I looked at it and said, to me, how can I make this game be a toolbox? Because one of the defining features of the Tiny D6 genre books is they are toolkits to emulate a genre, right? And to emulate a genre, you have to establish, it doesn't have to be accurate, it doesn't have to be all encompassing, but you have to have a baseline of what that genre means for the game, right? Tiny Cyberpunk's version of Cyberpunk doesn't have to match the widespread definition. It doesn't have to match anybody else's definition, but it has to have a consistent definition, or the game can't function. They won't know what it wants to do mechanically and narratively, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a good perspective on when you're designing a game, because I find that sometimes these kind of games, because I buy a lot of them, don't exactly have like they're trying to either do too much,
Right.
or they don't quite hit a mark that they were aiming for.
Absolutely, right. And that's a big problem. And for me, my solution is when I start any of these genre books, I try to know what the genre is, right? I sort of have this firm idea of my touch points for everything in this game are going to point at these things. They don't have to match everybody else's, but they should be consistent and they should be clear. So when people want to either use them or reject them, they know what they're doing, right?
Right.
And so for me, when I sat down for Tiny Cyberpunk, I was like, what to me defines a cyberpunk story? And for me, it's like we talked about the difference between cyber noir and cyberpunk. For me, cyber noir is the after effects of being on the losing side of cyberpunk. And so a cyberpunk game, by its act, for me, is active, it's aggressive, it's in the context of the setting, generally revolutionary or resistance-based or some sort of maybe not widespread, but uprising-esque thing, right? Cyberpunk is about the have-nots and the haves, with you being in the viewpoint of the have-nots.
Right. And there is like when I got this, and look, my favorite Cyberpunk game is Cyberpunk 2020. Like it's the thing that brought me into the Cyberpunk role-playing game world, and I played a lot of it. So, but when Red came out and the adventure in Red, the starter box was a resistance-based, like, you all live in a building and this corporation is going to demolish this building. What do you do? Right. That was like a breath of fresh air, because one of the threads that kind of comes through cyberpunk gaming is you sort of end up a lot of times being just mercenaries for the corporations.
Yeah. Right. Which is kind of the opposite of, we're back to the Deckard problem in Blade Runner, right?
Right.
In a large sense. And so that for me, that was my overriding design perspective of how I view sort of the literary or media genre of cyberpunk, is about that. And so I wanted to say, look, if you want to do the Blade Runner, if you want to do the thing where you are working for the corp or you are working for that, I mean, of course you can take the rule set and do that. That's how toolkits work, right? But inherently, the game does not enable that, because to me, the genre becomes not that genre if that story goes on too long, right? If you think about things like Cyberpunk 2077, you can start as a corp suit, but almost immediately you're burned.
Yeah, you're dumped in the street immediately, and
like it's like 10 minutes into the game, like they're just like, we screwed you.
Oh, we didn't quite kill you, but everything you had is just now burned to the ground.
Right.
But we didn't kill you.
Lucky you.
Lucky you, you know.
Yeah. So I think a big theme for me in Cyberpunk is that power corrupts, and the longer you hold on to power, the more you become like the people you took the power from, right? And to that degree, I think it shares a lot in common with literary fables about kings and stuff, right? Yeah, so and so became the king, and they became corrupted and tyrannical, right? And Cyberpunk is a lot of that same allegorical power corrupts, absolutely. Not even absolute power. Cyberpunk is just power corrupts, absolutely. The smallest modicum of power corrupts, right?
Yeah. As soon as you are not on the oppressed side, you're gonna start moving towards a way to keep that.
To use philosophy, it's a very Hobbesian take on the nature of humanity, right? Very Thomas Hobbes would be very happy with Cyberpunk. He probably thinks it's good. So to me, the game needs to kind of posit that way. And the way you do that is by, one, engineering the game to work that way, but two, making sure the mechanics play that way, right? Like, if I'm going to add, like, there is currently in the work in progress, but it's going to come out, there's not going to be a wealthy trait that you can take to have money.
Right. That makes sense.
Because that would again move you into the, if you like it, you can grab it from a different Tiny D6 game, plug it in, because toolbox game, right? Won't be hard to engineer, but that's going to come out, right? You can, there's things about scavenging or grabbing equipment or repurposing equipment. There's about hideouts and getting traced and tracked and being on the run. To me, the best sort of cyberpunk genre plays a lot like Andor meets Ocean's 11. Sort of this mix of heist where the team matters, everybody's skills matter because you're trying to do something. And it can be self-serving, because by being self-serving, you're also going to stick it to the people who need it. stuck to them, right? Or, but there's also like this blending of self-serving greed, right? Selfless. What's the term I always like to use? Self-serving selflessness,
Right,
right?
right, because you are gathering for yourself, but you're taking from someone who is doing something worse, and
Right, sort of the Robin Hood-esque
yeah,
mentality, if we were to use that, right? And so for me, when I sat down to make the game, that's kind of the orientation I tried to have to it. Now, because again, Toolkit, you'll see that, but it won't be hard to run whatever you want out of it. But that is, for me, the key defining element of the Cyberpunk is like a literary media genre. And
yeah,
so I wanted to capture that.
yeah. I think your Hobbesian reference. Life in the world of Cyberpunk is nasty, brutal, and short. Like that's that's the kind of vibe I'm looking for when I'm looking for a Cyberpunk game.
Right.
Is nasty, brutal, and short, and you're trying to break that loop. You're definitely not going to break that loop. Like that's just
Right.
not how this is going to happen.
Or if you do, the greatest risk is you become corrupted. Right.
Right. Yes,
Like,
absolutely.
you might break the loop, but now you're the problem, and they're going to try to break you next time. Right.
Yeah, and like when I usually run my campaigns, like I ran a couple cyborg runs, like okay,
Nice.
everybody is too powerful at this point. Like they had survived long enough after a couple of
Right.
reboots that they had gotten to the point where they had too much money. So I was like, I got to end this. So in a more of a storytelling fashion, I'd be like, all right, look, the arc is over. You've completed the arc. Now tell me how your
Right.
character dies. What killed your what what did you do in your life that got you killed after the
And
story?
exactly. And I think that's a big trap in RPG spaces, specifically with Cyberpunk, is a lot of RPGs are based around the acclamation and accumulation of power, be it from, in D&D magic items, levels, spells, hit points, whatever, right? In Cyberpunk RPGs, it's gear, it's creds, it's wealth, it's allies, it's that, in vampires generation, it's ghouls, domain, all that. Like RPGs are inherently about accumulating mechanical power, whatever that looks like in the game you are playing, for the most part. And in the Cyberpunk genre, that accumulation does tend to run counter to the core ethos of the medium. And so, as an RPG designer, there's a need to have a way to address that.
Yeah, there should always be a rock to your scissors. Like
Right.
whatever that is, like it's in the older games, it was like if you had too much armor, as long as if somebody had the right blade, they could just cut right through it if they got close enough.
Right.
Right? That sort of idea that there should be some way to bring you down. Like
And what I've done is for Tiny Cyberpunk, I've added these downtime mechanics where the corpse do things to you
oh, I love
in
that.
between missions. So yeah, you might have ran your mission, but now they've traced you. So basically, you can choose. Yeah, I'm going to spend my downtime accumulating power. Right, I'm going to get a new trade. I'm going to whatever. Right, or spend my downtime doing nothing, so the corp can't trace me. I'm just going to lay low. So if I don't lay low, the corp can take a corp action against me.
Right. And you know, this kind of leads into the next part of this, which is what kind of cyberpunk adventures do you like to run or even
Yeah,
what kind of
I I like the high stakes sort of John Woo action heist cyberpunk adventures. I like stuff that starts slow and builds to a really rapid crescendo. Preferably somebody will jump out of the window on the top floor of a skyscraper at some point. Like that's kind of key for me in all my cyberpunk things.
yeah, you got to make sure that glass window that
Yeah,
you go
you
right
got to
through it.
blast through it firing your guns, right?
Right,
Because
exactly.
because cyberpunk should be active, it should be aggressive, it should be in your face, it should feel like high throttle, high octane, John Woovian action, right? When push comes to shove, because cyberpunk is about trying to solve uh, systemic issues, corporate greed, whatever, through violent resistance, right? Maybe not physically violent, but technology or socially or culturally or whatever, right? You are trying to impose the, in anthropology, one of the things they teach you is, uh, you know, there's a distance between resistance and revolution, right? And the difference is aggression and action.
Right. And I think that's, to me, the thing that I like to see in in a cyberpunk adventure is like kind of an inciting incident that kind of sets up like some it's got to have some paranoia involved. Like this is, you're dealing with overwhelming forces. Like even though cyberpunk, and this is one of the things I can see a lot of times, is like power fantasies come into play, which is
Yeah,
why I think it is as popular as it is as a
absolutely.
RPG. But part of that gaining of power should be some sort of ethos or some kind of like reason you're doing it, because otherwise you would not be forcing your way through that, right?
Right.
You are trying to like I like I said, I really like that adventure of like you all live in the same place. I mean, this could be in any, this is very much a anti-colonialist kind of narrative, which is, you all live in the same place and the corporation is coming to destroy you, or the country
Right.
is coming to destroy you. What do you do? Right? The destruction is almost invariably inevitable, but you're going to try to stop it. Or you're going to stop it, but there are going to be massive consequences to that stopping it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a genre that has a lot of weirdly specific, almost like, I don't want to say requirements, but it's probably a good word to define it, that also don't quite work either. Like it's such a almost self-conflicted genre. And I think that's one reason people respond to it.
Yeah, I think you're right, because like there is this like, and it's one of these, it's the trope of the genre is you're playing a corp at this
Right.
point. It's or you're playing a cop. Like these are not in the modern world oppressed
Right.
peoples, but you've got to, if you want to, and most of the time I don't tend to have, I tend to say, yeah, we're not going to play with those classes or whatever you want to call them,
Right.
roles. And but if you can give me a good enough seed, like RoboCop, if you can give me RoboCop, like I'm on
Right.
board. But you gotta be like, and this is the kind of adventure stuff I want to see. If you're gonna play something that's against being like, some kind of low lifestyle person, you've got to tell me exactly why, or otherwise I don't want it. I don't. It's not, to me, part of the genre that I like.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's so interesting about the genre is everybody has this different take on what makes it work or what it is or a thing, right? And because the genre itself, even if you go back to the original material, is so conflicted, it's hard to say anybody's right or wrong. We're all kind of looking at uh this genre going, this is my take on it, right? This is so and so's take on it. Is ours right? Well, maybe,
It
right?
is one of the most modern of genres, and I'm saying modern in the kind of like, you're
Right,
drawing a circle around a group, and yourself. When you do this genre, you are drawing the circle, because you could, like we were talking about earlier, there are people that like would absolutely fight you to the death that Blade Runner is cyberpunk,
right.
like
And I
absolutely.
would have a hard time saying they're actually wrong,
Right,
right?
right. But you've drawn your circle over here, and they've drawn their
Right.
circle over here, and it's just whatever media or influences that are the core of your idea of cyberpunk. And that's why, to me, is very modern, because it's really your opinion that makes it what it is.
Right.
It's like modern art. Well, I think this is a beautiful piece of art. I think it's utter garbage. You're both
Right.
right. You're both right.
Yeah, it's very, and I think that's what makes it such an evocative, interesting genre, right? Like more than like fantasy, where I think there's some definitions we can all sort of agree on,
Yeah.
or sci-fi, where there's sort of this core understanding of what defines it. Cyberpunk, in a large sense, sort of eludes our ability to define it, and I think that's really engaging.
And that's why you can it's both, it's a double-edged sword, uh
Right.
double-edged monokatana, and you can come to a
You can't.
table thinking
If
that
it's double edged, it can't be a katana, Richie. They're single edged blades. I need you to get
sorry,
your fake cyberpunk history right.
sorry, a double-edged broadsword, a mono broadsword, fine.
Well, now you just look silly. Who carries that in a cyberpunk setting?
I mean, that's okay. Look, the whole like Asian there's a whole Asian peril thing that's wrapped up in Cyberpunk. I didn't really want to get into because we covered that on politics in Cyberpunk like 3 years ago, but
Yeah,
it
I think
is
I think anybody who wants to can experience that discussion by going back to that
yeah.
episode.
But in some ways you can rock up to a table and be like, I love Cyberpunk. And you sit down and you're like, what the fuck is this?
Right.
Now, if it's fantasy, you love fantasy, you run up and you're like, okay, I can kind of, like, there is like this weird, like,
Yeah.
not what you do include as this thing for yourself, right?
Right.
And I think that's why there are certain core keystone things that I think make why certain games and certain adventures become the core of the genre, right? Like literally you guys are all in a punk band, a band of some kind, right? That is a
Yeah.
core cyberpunk adventure. And like Ben was asking about alternate concepts for campaigns. How do you keep cyberpunk but play it as something other than Edge Runners and Shadowrunners? Can
Yeah.
Trauma Team campaigns still be cyberpunk, or is it cross the line and become wage slaves of the system? And
Right.
we've been kind of dancing around that somewhat, but like you were all like, you can see the oppression of the system. What are you going to do about that? That is,
I
you know,
to me, and again, this is my personal definition of cyberpunk. You know, uh, you can start the story however you want, but the end of Act One needs to remain cyberpunk. It needs to become a story about active aggression back against the system, right? You basically get all of Act One to set that up, but Act Two and Three better be about throwing a bottle through a window and taking a sledgehammer to something.
right. And that's the kind of like whatever that campaign, right? Whether it's the Trauma Team,
Right.
like you're going to see and do terrible things at the beginning because you're going to leave somebody behind that didn't pay the subscription for your service, right? There's going to be those like your coworkers are going to get, and there's actually an excellent when Cyberpunk 2077 was first kind of coming out, they were doing comics, and
The Trauma Team comic.
the Trauma Team comics is excellent. It's an excellent comic, and it shows you exactly how you would do a Trauma Team one shot or campaign, whatever you want to call it. Because at first she's all in, and then she has this like terrible experience when she goes into a building, and then she's been turned to the other, to fight against even her own Trauma Team, basically at the end. Spoilers, but not really, because it's excellent. You should totally read it. It's way better than what I'm talking about. But
I'll vouch for that.
But like, even if you're like, you guys are all wage slaves in the cubicle, like you're a bunch of net runners for Arasaka or whatever corporation you want to put a name on, like, and you do some fucked up shit, and you're like, oh, fuck.
Yeah, and to me, that's sort of the thing that you have to. In the end, RPGs are the medium where the audience is also the author, and so all I can do is hand you the writing tools and watch what you write, right? So I just have to make sure I hand you the tools to help you tell what I think is going to be the story you want to tell.
Right. And I think that like there will be people that will just play like, oh, hey, here's a mission. Go do this mission, right?
Right.
You know, it's like if that's your fun, like cool, that's your
You're
fun.
fun.
But we as deep fans of this genre love the ethos and pathos and a lot of the other parts of it that make it more than just like, okay, this is just tech porn. Like of just like,
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, and I mean, I think you could have multiple podcasts trying to unpack it and never reach a resolution, right?
absolutely. And
I think is
I didn't contemplate doing another side podcast called 20 minutes into the future. I don't have art and or music for that
you have
at
to
all.
call it Cyberpunk 2020 minutes into the future. See, you did it all wrong.
Okay, dad joke checked off and on. But you're right.
I do what I'm asked to do on the show. I fulfill my role.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. That's I mean, like you can just pick any part of the modern world as the start for an alternate campaign concept. You're
Yeah.
you're the bodyguards for a high level corp,
Right.
and they do something fucked up, and you're all burned.
Right.
Go right.
Yeah, I mean, I would again always point out like the best place to start is take a heist thing, and then Oceans or Leverage is a great example of what is basically a cyberpunk thing without any of the tech, right? Like here's a team of criminals that were used by corporations to accomplish things, and then they got burned by one of the corporations, and now they're out to get their own back, right? Like aside from the fancy gear, which they also have a lot of that, but it's only not cyberpunk because it's not set 20 years into the future.
Well, I mean, I would argue that if you got a hacker, because hackers were basically invented. I mean, they were here for a lot. There were radio hackers and phone hackers before there were, and I have a whole thing about that. But hackers were really brought to the mainstream by cyberpunk media. Before they became headline news, there were hackers in these, in this, and it sort of leads into Tin Man's question is like, how do you get hacking right in cyberpunk RPGs? Meaning still useful, but not a solo side session everyone dreads. How do you?
That's complicated. And that is one of the things, coming back to Tiny Cyberpunk, I kind of struggled with was how do I distill these inherently complex ideas into a minimalist framework? Because minimalist isn't about cutting everything out, it's about cutting out everything but the essentials, right? And so hacking is essential, so hacking's going to have to be in there, but how do I cut it down enough that it feels essential but not too much? And that's hard. We bounced on a lot of ideas. One of the big things I ended up doing was that hacking requires either preparation or being on site, right? So as a downtime thing, you can prep and do an offsite. But if you don't, you got to be on site. And even when you're hacking takes your normal actions. You don't move into a different state. You don't, jump into the matrix. And the actions you take are specific and they do specific things. So like operate, well, that means you open a door, right? I operate the door. What's the door do when it's operated? It opens, right? Stuff like that. And so I sat down and looked at all the pieces that I needed to have to mechanically make it work without overwhelming it, and then tried to layer them. Like if the enemy, instead of shooting a guard, if the enemy is the hack, what does that look like? How do I represent not hit points, but how do I represent that resistance that you have to overcome to accomplish your mission? And
Yeah,
then how do I turn that into active participation in the combat or the scenario?
right. And my solution to this has always been like, okay, so, and this is a pitfall of like almost every classical cyberpunk, Shadowrun, all of these games have this pitfall where you basically build another dungeon that one person plays. Like,
Right.
and at this point, I would almost look at some of the solo games if you really want to play that kind of like uh
Yeah.
that kind of style of game, because I know there are a lot of those kind of solo cyberpunk games out there. I think I
Yeah.
bought
Yeah.
one, but uh in the way I generally think of it is like you're going to be doing skills and doing things just as anybody else is doing. But the
Right.
way that I'm going to describe it as the game master is I'm going to tell you all these fantastical, it's going to be your world is going to be vastly weirder looking
Right.
or than anybody else, because you're going to be dealing with this alternate landscape. But
Yeah. And
you have to be there on the property. Like there is no remoting in. It just
yeah.
doesn't, no remoting in
And
unless I can fry your
and
brain.
for me, I tried to approach it from, if we're talking about dungeons as the analogy here, instead of building them a separate dungeon, I say what are the parts of the dungeon only the rogue interacts with,
Right. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
those are the hacker parts, right? Like the hacker is the rogue. So instead of picking a lock, they're hacking the interface. So how do I represent that, right? And one of the things I did was when you hack something, you have what are called kickbacks. If you fail the hack roll, these things happen to you, right? And the basic kickback is it boots you out of the system, right? And you have to just kind of start over. But some of the worst ones are things like you take damage because like you get a feedback current, or they trace you and send a team to your location. Which means if you're off by yourself as the hacker without any of your teammates with you and you have a bad kickback, well, you could be dead.
Right. You are vulnerable in ways that other characters are not. And
Right.
I think
So
that's
there is a benefit to being on site anyway, because if you screw up, the medic can still first aid you, right?
right. They can try and keep your vitals
Right.
stable while you're still vulnerable and like, trying to work your way through the terrible brain trauma that you're incurring. But I think to me that's the heart of how you do that is you basically just kind of like make sure that everybody's interacting on the same level
Yep. I agree.
and just painting the world in a different color with more interesting words.
Right. And for me, it's about breaking down the action into discrete moments that you can resolve and move on, so everybody gets a turn in the spotlight. Because one of the big problems with some of the older cyberpunk games is they would turn hacking into a mini game that you had to resolve it all at once. You couldn't stop, right? Once we started hacking, I've got to resolve it so we can move forward, right?
Right.
And
It's
what I've tried to do is say, I'm going to break these things into chunks. So every time we do initiative, right, I can do my chunk, you can do your chunk. And that my hack is part of that. And then I move to the next step, right? Almost a ladder effect.
yeah, exactly. Cause it is one of those things where like, okay, so you guys are gonna play this game and then we're gonna go get pizza, have pizza and beers, and then come back.
Right.
Because that's kind of the classically. But I think just keeping everybody on the same level, I think is a good answer
Yeah,
to that question.
absolutely.
All right, Alan, this is the part where you get to shill your game.
Boom. I'm Alan Bahr. I run Gallant Games. I've got a Kickstarter, Tiny Cyberpunk. It's pretty dope. You should go back in and give me money.
Sick. I have
If
already
you like
given
what
you
I'm hearing, you're hearing here. So
right.
if you don't like what you're hearing here, then you probably don't want to back it because you probably don't like it. So
I have already backed it. So, I'm already in the bag for this game. One of the reasons we're talking about it. But, I figured we could talk about the genre and then talk about the game. So,
yeah,
uh
legit.
so I've got some quick cutting questions about Tiny Cyberpunk.
Let's do it. Fire away.
It's like, why are you doing a Cyberpunk game now?
Because there's enough space between the last couple of big Cyberpunk game releases that I feel like we have some room to market and grow.
Excellent. Excellent answer. How are you getting the punk into this game?
The game tries to distill the ethos I've already talked about on this podcast into a mechanical chassis.
What are the new systems in this Tiny D6 game?
Hacking, drone operation. We have modified versions of the vehicle chases from Tiny Spies, and then there's a new downtime system that involves corporation actions.
Why is black and white the perfect choice for the interior of this game?
because it's affordable.
Why are the stretch goals overrated?
Because they bloat projects and cause projects to be late and cause a lot more stress than they need. And I'm in this to make a living.
Those are the quick cutting questions. If you have your own quick cutting questions, come on the Discord. Alan will come at you, because he is one of the fine patrons and Discord members, and he will answer your questions. Also, anywhere else Gallant games exists, Alan is there. He is an omnipresent force in the universe. I should have come up with a better omnipresent AI in the universe. Benevolent so far. Now. So far, he's benevolent. Everyone else thinks AIs are. Anyways, speaking of patrons, I'm glad to have all the patrons. You can go to patreon.com/fullmetalrpg. I did not charge anybody this month because I didn't get anything out last month. So I'm going to blaze a bunch of stuff in the next week, so you can have something to listen to while you're at your if you're American, you're at your Thanksgiving thing. You can like put this in your ears and not listen to your uncle say some terrible things. And thanks everybody. Thanks, Alan. Have a good night.
Thank you. Boom.
Boom.